Bienvenidos. We are delighted that you've joined us this afternoon for one in a series of 2009-2010 Millennium Lectures. This afternoon's lecture is co-sponsored by UTEP Center for Inter-American and Border Studies, and I'd like to thank the center and its executive director, Ricardo Velázquez, for their support and participation. The theme of this year's Millennium Lecture Series is contemporary issues, and our current focus has been on Latin America. We've invited distinguished speakers to share with us their perspectives on critical issues that are likely to shape the future of our society for generations to come. The Paso del Norte is a geographic, economic, and philosophic convergence. In this wonderful and wonderfully complex community, we at UTEP and in the community have an eagle's eye view of two countries' interdependence. And in the 21st century, the United States and Mexico share political and economic challenges, both old and new. We're honored to have as our speaker today one who brings a vast store of knowledge and experience to confronting these challenges in the Americas, Ambassador Jeffrey Davidow. In a distinguished 34-year Foreign Service career, Jeffrey Davidow's primary focus was on Latin America. He served in the embassies of Guatemala, Chile, and Venezuela, later returning to Venezuela as U.S. Ambassador from 1993 to 1996. As Assistant Secretary of State from 1996 to 1998, he was the State Department's chief policymaker for the Western Hemisphere before his appointment by President Clinton to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. He continued in that position under the Bush administration until 2002. Retiring in 2003 with the rank of Career Ambassador and as one of the highest-ranking American diplomats, Ambassador Davidow has since served as President of the Institute of the Americas in San Diego. The Institute promotes throughout the Hemisphere programs and policies aimed at increasing dialogue and encouraging cooperation in the areas of investment, trade, and social services. Ambassador Davidow is also a writer. Many of you have undoubtedly read at least one of his books, the aptly titled The U.S. and Mexico, the Bear and the Porcupine, which explores the complex attitudes and perspectives that define the relationship between our neighboring countries, including the highly charged issue of immigration. Early last year, as White House advisor for the Summit of the Americas, Ambassador Davidow's extensive experience served to guide President Obama's first Inter-American Leadership Summit. Please join me now in extending a warm UTEP welcome to Ambassador Jeffrey Davidow.
Thank you, Madam President. It's an honor to be here. I have always felt, and I felt this way when I was ambassador of the United States in Mexico, that UTEP was a shining example of an institution that actually got it, that understood the nature of the U.S.-Mexican relationship, and which was willing to dedicate resources and goodwill to improving that relationship. And I want to thank you for the invitation, and I want to thank Diana Natalicio for being a national leader. I thought what I would do today is to talk informally. Look, no notes, nothing up my sleeves, for about 20, 25 minutes. I like to give people a deadline. It keeps hope alive, I find. To talk for about 25 minutes about the challenges of Latin America, and then have a conversation about either what I've talked about or any other questions that you might have. And when I talk about challenges of Latin America, I'm talking about those challenges which confront Latin America itself. But they're also our challenges, because I think everyone in this room recognizes that the kind of relationship that we can establish with the countries of this hemisphere will be increasingly important for us and our kids and our grandkids. So although these challenges or problems or situations really have to be dealt with, and where they are negative must be resolved by Latin Americans themselves, we have a concern and we have a role to play. Now, let me just say that I really think that the most important factor of life in this hemisphere, and by the way, let me put in a parenthesis right now. When I talk about Latin America, I'm really talking about the entire hemisphere, even though some of the countries, particularly the Caribbean ones, are not Latin. But I think what I'll say refers to them as well. So I really should talk about the Western Hemisphere, but it's just easier to say Latin America, so bear with me. The fundamental fact of this region that is at times so obvious we forget it is an endemic, continuing poverty. Today, 200 years after Latin America began its independence process, roughly contemporaneously with ours, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the population still must be considered poor. Not by our standards, but by the standards of their individual governments. Every country in the hemisphere has statistical bureaus that determine the poverty level. And in country after country, poverty still afflicts close to half of the population. That means that close to half of the population, and in some countries, more than half of the population, lives without the essential goods and services that promote human dignity. This should offend us as human beings, but it should also concern us as political animals. Because poverty is inherently a provocation of instability. When people are poor and lack hope, they are prone to political action which can, on many occasions, not serve their own interests or their interests of their country. Now, here's an important historical point that we should keep in mind. For most of the history of the world, or the written history, human history, most people have been poor. Most people in most countries, 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, were poor. The difference today and in modern times is that we live in essentially a changed environment, a more democratic, a more open environment in which the poor do not have to suffer quietly. They want to take controls of their lives, and the relaxation of authoritarian control gives them more opportunities. So, I'll come back to this, but the first problem in Latin America is that there are too many poor people. The second challenge of Latin America is the whole issue of governance. I'm not saying government, I'm saying governance, ending with an A-N-C-E. How well are countries governed? What are the rules? Is there respect for law and the rules of the game? And in many countries, this is deficient. That the governments exist not for the people, but rather to give those who are governing certain advantages, whether financial or otherwise. So another challenge of Latin America is promoting decent, good, serviceable governments. And a final specific challenge that I think exists, and is tied to the first two, is the whole question of citizen safety, security. Do people feel comfortable in their societies? Do they feel that they can walk safely in the streets, start a business without having to pay exorbitant corruption? Do the rules of the game apply? Now, I want to talk about each of these three things because I think it's important, because they do come together and they do provide the major challenges to this hemisphere. First, let's talk about poverty. As I said, close to half the people in the hemisphere live in poverty. In many countries, about a quarter of the people live in what we would call abject poverty. The kind of poverty that can promote malnutrition among children. The kind of poverty that can actually kill. Now, there have been changes in Latin America over the last couple of decades, and this is encouraging. Government after government has adopted rational economic policies which have had the general effect of lowering the level of poverty, particularly abject poverty. The clearest example of this, and it's ironic and tragic at the same time, is Chile, where the government adopted economic and fiscal policies, and I'll talk about some of those, which have helped Chile reduce endemic poverty from in the 40% down to below 20%, and almost eliminate abject poverty. Well, what's the Chilean model? Can other countries follow it? Yes, they can, and they have been. The idea is that governments should act responsibly. Basically, and this is going to sound like rocket science, they shouldn't spend money that they ain't got. I feel like I'm talking to my kids, you know. They should have separation of authority between the executive branch and the reserve bank or the central bank, so that the president of the country cannot dip his or her hands in and take out money whenever the mood strikes. They should have rules of the game that govern investment, both domestic and foreign, so that new businesses and new jobs can be created. There should be a general separation of powers when it comes to dealing with money, with the executive having its responsibilities, the legislative having responsibilities, and the judiciary watching both. And in country after country, this model has been successful. So we saw in the 1990s and in the early part of this century, levels of poverty going down, but not enough and not fast enough. but yet there has been progress when governments that are utilizing good governance models speak to the needs of their populations. Now, there's an interesting correlation between this kind of good economic governance and good political governance. You know, for many of us in this room of a certain age, our memories of Latin America are very much influenced by the experiences of, and our own experiences of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when almost every country in South America and Central America, almost every, was governed by military dictatorships. Latin America was a region of authoritarian controls which at one level or another were mildly repressive or horribly repressive. At the worst end, you would find governments in which people would disappear. They'd be taken from their homes and killed without trial, without procedure. And in some other countries, it tended to be, military governments tended to be a little less oppressive, but there was no free press, there was no functioning Congress. That started to end, and significantly ended, in the 1980s. So the image that some of us still have of Latin America governed by dictators wearing, non-reflective sunglasses, that's not the case. And indeed, every country in Latin America is now a democracy of one form or another, except we can definitely say Cuba is not a democracy. And we saw during the 1990s, in the beginning of this century, a move by governments to give greater voice to their people. And as the people enjoyed democracy, and as the governments implemented new economic policies, things got better. The gross domestic product, which is the clearest example of this, of the wealth of a nation, went up in the first half of this decade at a rate of about 5% per annum, a very good growth rate for Latin America. And the number of democratic elections, alternation of government from one party to another, the strengthening of political institutions, whether the Congresses or the courts or what have you, that all continued. But just as in this question of confronting poverty and improving the economic situation, there have been successful countries and unsuccessful countries in the political field. There have been successful democratic transitions and, unfortunately, disasters of one form or the other or another in the making. The classic example of this is Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. But Venezuela is not alone. There are 2 or 3 other, maybe more than 2 or 3, 4 or 5 other countries, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, maybe even Argentina, in which we have seen a decay of democratic governance in recent years. And it is a particularly difficult and complex process because the people who are running these countries did not come to power by military coups. They were elected. And then they have used the mechanisms of democracy to do away with democracy. And how the world responds to that is very difficult, because Hugo Chavez can say, the majority in Congress voted to allow me to serve as president for an innumerable amount of terms. The majority of the Supreme Court, all of whom I appointed and threw out the ones I didn't like, have looked at the laws that I have passed and they said they're okay. I run a democratic nation. Well, no, he doesn't. And so one of the problems that Latin America is facing is this decay of democratic institutions in some countries. In other countries, democracy is flourishing. Chile just had elections. Brazil will have elections this year. The new president of Uruguay was sworn in the other day. The new president of Costa Rica. In Colombia, a very effective president, Álvaro Uribe, changed the Constitution once, or the Congress changed the Constitution once, to allow him to run for a second term. This was 4 years ago, and he won easily. He got it into his head that he'd like to run for a third term, and asked the Congress to change the Constitution again. And the Supreme Court stepped in, a separate power base, and said, no, Mr. President, you have to leave. Our Constitution will not allow this. And he's going. That's what democracy is. When more than one man can run the show, when more than one governmental institution has a voice. But the countries that have done the worst jobs in promoting democracy, or conversely, the best jobs of destroying democracy, are those countries that have also done the worst job of improving the lives of their citizens. And the governments that preceded these anti-democratic governments bear some of the responsibility. The governments that preceded Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which is a rich country, relatively, with its tremendous amount of oil income, did not do enough to extend the benefits of that oil income, to make the economy grow, and to reduce poverty fast enough. And so along comes a man on a white horse, whether it's Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or Evo Morales in Bolivia, or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, or Correa in Ecuador, and he says, these guys, this ancien regime that's been running this country for decades, has done nothing for you, the poor. Vote for me, and I'll change things. And when those people get into office, and I'm not saying all politicians are this way, they move against any opposition within the democratic system that can stop them from doing what they want. And in many cases, have the support of the majority of the population. Hugo Chavez is losing support in Venezuela, but I would say that probably close to half of the population still supports him. Why? Because he is using the funds of the state in the most erratic and foolish way to give out money. And he's giving money to people, and everybody enjoys getting money. But he's not using those funds to build Venezuela. And we're seeing this. Every family gets a few $100s a month, maybe every poor family. But Venezuela doesn't have electricity now in its capital city because the money has been used for political purposes rather than for building sufficient electricity infrastructure. How many of you remember the movie Evita? Okay. Well, I'm glad to see that. I was talking to a group of students not long ago, and I said that, remember Evita? And they just looked at me, you know. The look that I call the stunned mullet, you know, lips slightly parted. And then I said, Madonna? And they all went, oh yeah, we know the Madonna. But you remember that scene at the height of Evita's power, and it's such a telling scene. She's riding across the pampas of Argentina in a train, literally throwing pesos out the window. It's a wonderful scene. And that's what Hugo Chavez does. He goes around throwing pesos out of his car window, essentially. And you can buy enough support until your economy collapses. Now, the Venezuelan economy is in very bad shape. It may not collapse because it has its tremendous oil resources. But sooner or later, that country is going to be in very, very deep problems. So the challenges of Latin America have to do with the economy, how to run economies in such a way that people have opportunity and can get out of poverty, how to run governments so that the people have a voice, feel that they are being governed by honest people so that they become less susceptible to the men on the white horses who are probably bigger thieves than the people they disrespect. And part of this then relates to that third major challenge, which is citizen safety. If one travels in the hemisphere, and I have the opportunity to do a fair amount, and you talk, and one talks to average people and have a conversation or visit friends or what have you, the overwhelming highest concern in every country is safety. We used to be able to go downtown and walk around on the weekends. Everybody says the same thing, which I don't believe. We used to be able to leave our houses with the doors open. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But now we can't because of the violence in our streets. And there's violence in our streets because of drugs, because our police are ineffectual, because the courts are corrupt or ineffectual. And this is a major concern in Latin America. And I think it may not be too long before we see in some countries a return to authoritarian governments that promise better handling of the citizen safety issue, although in point of fact they won't be able to do it. And so Latin America will be, and I hope I'm wrong, infested not only with the populist authoritarians like Chavez and his ilk, but maybe some really hard right, maybe military governments that will argue that they must do something against crime. Now, having said all of this, I'm relatively optimistic, believe it or not. I think in Latin America, there is a growing mood, prompted by a growing middle class, of people who are demanding of their governments better governance, better economic policy, separation of powers, rules of the game, better police, tougher judges. respect for institutions. And we see that in country after country. And that's why when I look at a country like Brazil, or Chile, or Peru, or Colombia, or Costa Rica, or even Salvador, and others I could name, I think there's room for hope. But Latin America is facing this nexus of problems and challenges that I mentioned. Well, what does it mean for us? Can the U.S. solve these problems? No. We have variations of some of them in our own country. They're hard enough. We cannot bring the answers to Latin America. And President Obama understands that. I was with him at the Summit of the Americas when he met all of the hemispheric leaders. And there were some who said, oh, he's coming and he's going to offer a great new plan for Latin America, another alliance for progress, another good neighbor policy. And he didn't. I think this is wise. First, the American people are not particularly in the mood for this kind of generosity. And secondly, Latin Americans are more interested these days in demonstrating their own independence and their ability to deal with problems. But we can help as a country. We can help on the public safety side. The Merida Initiative in Mexico, the Plan Colombia in Colombia are important dedications of resources on our part to fight the criminal narco traffickers. And in other countries, we are offering police training and judicial training and best practices on how to run open and decent court systems. We are working with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and other groups, as well as our own programs, to help encourage investment in Latin America, to help small and medium businesses get established and provide new jobs, to engage in microfinance so that peasant women can have a small amount of money to go out and buy a sewing machine or a tortilla press to start their own businesses so their kids can stay in school. And we are working with like-minded Latin American governments to uphold the concepts of democracy. But here I must say that this is a disappointment. The desire for Latin American solidarity is so great. Latin Americans and their political leaders feel so intensely that they have to maintain their ranks closed and support each other that it is very hard to find Latin Americans in leadership positions who are willing to speak out against the decay of democracy that we see in countries like Venezuela. Interestingly, last week, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which is an independent agency of the Organization of American States, issued a report, 300 pages, outlining the decline of democracy in Venezuela. Dead on, no questions. But few political leaders in Latin America will defend that report. So, it's a mixed picture, and I'll stop now. The challenges to the Western Hemisphere, to Latin America, are economic, they're political, they're ones of public safety, they're also ones of inability to confront problems such as the decline of democracy, even if only in a rhetorical fashion. Nevertheless, today's Latin America is a more just, a more humane, a more prosperous part of the world than it was 20 years ago. And I'm optimistic that 20 years from now, it will be even better. Thank you.
I would be interested in knowing your views on the importance of free trade agreements in addressing and reducing the levels of poverty in Latin America, not just to the United States, but with the European Union or other large trading blocs?
I think free trade agreements are important, less so for the impact on the United States than for the impact on other countries. And they are important, and this may surprise you, not so much in economic terms, because there are ways in which countries can trade and trade rather abundantly with each other without free trade agreements. But what is important is that when a country enters a free trade agreement, it is also taking on a lot of responsibilities in relation to how its economy is run, how it attracts foreign investment, how the government deals with its credit and its reserves. And so free trade agreements are emblematic of countries that have entered into the world economy and are acting responsibly. Now, we have negotiated free trade agreements with, of course, Mexico, Canada, Chile, Peru in this hemisphere. We have agreements that we've already negotiated with Panama and Colombia that really should be presented to Congress for ratification. But this is a political problem. Even though a free trade agreement with Panama is not going to damage our interests in any way and may marginally help us and help Panama, the opposition at this time in the American Congress and in American society towards all elements of globalization and opening up and free trade, and I don't think that opposition represents a majority of people, but it represents enough so that it is politically risky, in my view, or in the view of both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, to look for a congressional fight on that. But I strongly believe in the power of free trade agreements, as I say, not only because of the economic impact, but because of the societal and legal impacts that you see in the countries that subscribe to them. Yes, sir.
Given the huge amount of drug money that's available to corrupt Mexico, is it realistic to assume that they're ever going to be able to stabilize the situation given that huge amount of money?
You know, it's a decent question. And it's actually a larger question, whether, given what Mexico has to confront, I'd put it this way, in terms of living beside either the largest or one of the largest markets for illegal drugs in the world, given an essentially open border which allows cash and guns to flow south, given weak institutions in Mexico, given our inability in this country to do very much to reduce drug utilization, the question is, can much be done? I applaud what President Calderon is doing. I think it had to be done because Mexico, and he saw this, Mexico was losing control of its sovereignty. All of us know that Mexico is a country that is fixated on issues of sovereignty, of government being in control. And there are cities in Mexico, even states in Mexico, where the government is losing the ability to govern to the narcotics traffickers. So the response of President Calderon is the correct one. It is immensely difficult, what he has undertaken, probably more difficult than he understood. But as long as Mexican government and Mexican people are willing to pursue this, then I think it's our responsibility to be helpful to them. And we should do that, and I think we are.
Couldn't we be helpful by cutting out the money, by legalizing it and take the money off the table?
No, you know, I think that's, I don't want to we can sit down and have a drink and talk about legalization of drugs. If anybody in this room, and there are many people in this room who have dealt with drug use in their families, I don't think many of them would like to see legalization. Keep in mind that drugs are illegal because they're bad. They're not bad because they're illegal. Now, I think there is a change going on in this country, and we may see some change in relation to marijuana. I come from California, where through one device or another, the possession of marijuana has essentially been decriminalized. But if you're talking about cocaine, if you're talking about methamphetamines, if you're talking about heroin, this is dangerous stuff. And I don't think the problem would go away by legalizing it. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I concur with you regarding the one of the aspects you brought up about Mexico just now in terms of its weak institutions being a problem. The organization I work for, we have zeroed in on the governance, a matter as being at the core of the problem that Mexico is facing, that as a result we have the violence and the crime and the rampant lack of public safety. So my question is that given Mexico has been coming down in the ranks regarding institutions, and all the competitiveness indicators where institutions is one of the indices that come into play in measuring competitiveness, what is the likelihood of any kind of more in-depth collaboration between the United States and Mexico in sort of revamping the judicial system, knowing that Mexico has those sovereignty issues that you also alluded to? We were told by the U.S. ambassador to Mexico that perhaps there might be hope, given Calderon's sort of attitude in terms of recognizing that the problem is huge, to the extent that perhaps it's time to let go of some of these sovereignty pseudo issues that I call them. So, given your insight into the workings of those levels of cooperation, do you even see it viable that Mexico allows collaboration in revamping judicial systems and institutions that are weak or absent, and therefore we have no rule of law, and therefore we have the crime and violence we have in the violence?
Well, perhaps. We're seeing, greater levels of U.S. assistance to Mexico, certainly in terms of police work, certainly in terms of some judicial reform. Some states in Mexico have adopted oral arguments in the judicial process, because when you have an open court case in which people come in and have to speak their for or against, there's less chance of behind-the-scenes corruption. I don't think Mexico necessarily needs much help from the United States in this regard, quite frankly. This is not brain surgery. I mean, we could sit down together ourselves and figure out, or the Mexicans in this audience could sit down and figure out what has to be done in terms of courts, in terms of police. Is there the political will to do it? That's the issue. And political will cannot be imported. So, I think the U.S. should stand ready to be helpful, to provide experts, to provide financial resources when that helps. But the initiative and the motivation has to be Mexican. Yes, sir.
Your first point on too many poor people, and as a Catholic I can say this, and to other Catholics if I offend you, I hope I do, is that the church has not taken a position on birth control, allowing birth control, and I think this is one of the problems not only in this hemisphere but in Africa and all other very poor continents, where you have a tremendous amount of growth at the very poor area where your wealthier families have smaller families. And this becomes a problem in the economic development of these families. I've got some other points. I just want to run them by you quick because I know there's other people that want to speak. You mentioned the 50s or the 60s in our image of these dictators we would refer to as banana dictators. But the situation had developed then, not only with Somoza and Batista, but with Marcos in the Philippines and Diem in Vietnam, where these individuals would say, or their governments would take a position that they were anti-communist, and the United States would back them 100%. In many instances, they were worse than the communists. But just the fact that we were in the Cold War and we needed their support, we would easily support them. And then when the communists came on board, especially we saw this with Castro, using the poverty, as you've discussed, it was a natural fit for the communists to begin taking over some of these countries. You mentioned the government, the governance. I don't think you really got into that too much, but at least here in the United States, we had an opportunity in the 1700s to run our country for a small period of time before the French-Indian War, and then the British wanted us to pay for it, and then we had taxation without representation, and we eventually became a country. Spain did not leave this legacy to any of these countries, so the people wound up without any ability or any previous knowledge to experience to be able to run their own countries. And as a Hispanic, you know, I can say that I think very easily without taking any offense. But you mentioned also the training of the police now in the methods to combat the narcotics. Does this remind you of anything we were doing in the 80s with training the military? And then the military were used to suppress the people more because the military were under the control of the dictators. And are we just creating another situation that we went through 30, 40 years ago? And finally, I think in a way, the discussion we're having politically in this country right now with the health care bill is just kind of a warm-up for the next big issue, which is going to be the discussion on immigration. And people are going to come down on one side or another, and I think they're here on the border. We may have a totally biased opinion that welcome immigrants, but you go to other places in the heartland where you don't have that same feeling. You go to bigger cities, and you find that the individuals that work in your lower paid jobs, especially in restaurants and in hotels, are all immigrants. And some of those industries would literally collapse without the immigrants, whether they're legal or otherwise. So we've got a very difficult situation. I think was mentioned drugs. And just in general, these countries have a tremendous amount of resources, maybe as much as we do. But for somehow it's been lost.
I want to give other people a chance. In all of that, there was one question. The question is whether our training that we're doing today is similar to military training we might have done during the time of the Latin American dictators. I think not. I think if a country is democratic and democratically run, if it has good control over its military, it needs assistance from the United States in terms of training or equipment, and that there is good civilian control. I think that we have an obligation to be helpful, especially in countries like Colombia and Mexico, where at least a good part of their problem stems from drug utilization in this country. So I think we always have to be very careful about these things, but I don't think that it is a mistake to be helpful where we can be in this regard. Okay. I don't think there are any more. Well, yes, there is. All right, there is.
Yes, I'm curious about your views on the current U.S. policy on immigration with Mexico. Any thoughts on how that might be improved or changed?
Okay. I'll be brief. Look, our immigration policy in this country is broken. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because we are unwilling to recognize realities. One of the realities is that we have an integrated labor pool between the United States and Mexico. Mexicans who come to the United States in an undocumented fashion come essentially to find work and to have a better life. And by the way, the proof of this, in a rather sad and opposite use of statistics, is the number of undocumented aliens in the United States has dropped significantly in the last 2 years. Why? Because the jobs aren't here, and it is better to go home. And the number of undocumented aliens entering the United States has dropped very dramatically as well. So until such time that we are prepared to recognize this reality and try to do something about it, to organize it, to deal with it, then we're going to have immigration policies that make no sense. Now, there are a lot of constituent elements to why the policy is broken, but let me give you an example of how bad it's broken. In California, and we don't usually think of California this way, California's either number 1 or 2 industry is agriculture. It's a major agricultural state. Probably about 1 million people working in agro industry in California. Probably somewhere around 750,000 are undocumented aliens from Mexico. If they were to leave, of course, the industry in the state would collapse. But we're unwilling to recognize that reality and say, okay, let's find a way of ordering this flow of people, of getting people out of the shadows, letting them live in a more humane fashion. We won't recognize that. We won't recognize this other fact. We all know that there are probably about 6-7 million undocumented alien Mexicans in the United States. Of that number, probably 1 million have already been told that they are going to receive their green cards. They've passed the necessary hurdles, but we have a limit. We can only give out about 125,000 green cards a year to Mexicans. So you have to wait 10 years. We could lower the number of undocumented aliens in this country by having a more realistic quota system. And there are numerous other changes that could be made. Are we going to get a comprehensive immigration reform, which by that I mean legalizing or giving amnesty to those who are already in the country, normalizing the arrival of others, dealing with some of these problems? I don't think the political mood is ready in the United States for that. But I do think that there are other things, such as the ones I've mentioned about temporary agricultural workers, about the limits on the number of green cards, that we could confront and we could do something about. But we lack political will, and that's unfortunate. Sir.
Ambassador, thank you. Welcome to El Paso.
Thank you.
I frequently refer to my external friends as the edge of the known universe. You talk about the Hemisphere, and if I could bring it down to a little more micro level, the community of El Paso is about 800,000 people. Up until a couple of years ago, the community of Juarez was about 1,600,000. It's now being reported to have a population of about 1.2 to 1.3 million. El Paso's population has increased over the last 24 months. During the period, there have been 4,000 murders in Juarez by somewhere between 30 and 100,000 people. As the human and financial capital of our sister city flees the condition over there, which has become intolerable, what perspective do you offer as a globalist to the local imperatives and emergencies?
Well, I think the most offensive kind of speakers are the globalists who come and tell you what you ought to do in your own backyard, okay? I don't doubt your analysis of the situation, and it is particularly, from my perspective, one that in some way reflects the history of Juarez and El Paso. I always felt, when I was ambassador, that Juarez and El Paso really, like UTEP, was the example on the frontier of cities that are actually working together, collaborating, with the civic leadership on both sides. And this created, I think, a sense of oneness on both sides. So it doesn't surprise me, and I'll accept what you say, if, given that sense of oneness, people are leaving the more dangerous half of the entity and moving to the less dangerous half. I don't know how you deal with it. I'm not entirely sure, and again, I don't know enough. I'm not entirely sure it's necessarily a problem for El Paso. Probably does impose
a short-term financial boom, but a long-term legacy of a sister city abandoned by its. Well,
that is a problem, but in terms of its immediate impact on El Paso, it may not be tremendously negative. But I think there's, I don't have an answer for you. I mean, and I wouldn't even suggest one. What's happening in Ciudad Juarez, and all of you know it better than I do, seems to me tragic. I think at some point the situation will stabilize. I hope it stabilizes for the good rather than status quo ante. But Juarez is in the middle of a battle, middle of a war, and it's hard to know how these things will end. And I certainly am not going to give advice. Okay? Yes, well, thank you.
Very much. I want to thank Ambassador Davidow again for taking time to be with us today, and I have a small token of appreciation for you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. There are reception space outside where you can interact informally with the ambassador and with each other. Thank you for coming.